Hey guys. Tonight we raid. The wind smells like salt, pine resin, and possibly someone's last meal, which wasn't great going down and definitely isn't better coming up. You're clutching the side of a longship as it pitches across the North Sea. Your fingers frozen around rough timber, knuckles white, wondering why you agreed to be part of this opportunity. Above you, the sail billows like the belly of a sea god, deep red and cracked with salt, and the sea slaps against the hull like it's got a personal grudge. Welcome to the Viking invasion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You huddle in your oiled wool cloak as another wave crashes over the prow, soaking your boots. The ship groans, not in pain, but in warning. The other warrior, sir, business associates, depending on how well you like the mare sharpening blades, adjusting leather straps, and occasionally vomiting discreetly over the edge. There's a lot of bravado, but even seasoned raiders glance nervously at the horizon. Britain lies just beyond it, soft and green and mostly unsuspecting. For now, a Viking longship could carry 40 to 60 men, packed tighter than salted herring, with room for supplies, weapons, and the occasional goat. Fun fact: one historic find revealed a longship where the planks were riveted with animal bones, probably a mix of "let's use what we've got" and "don't mess with our boat spirits." Historians still argue whether this was common practice or just some wild regional flair. You can't see land yet, but you feel it. That strange calm before the coast appears like the ocean holding its breath. And then the signal comes. A low grunt from the helmsman, a tilt of the sail, a sudden hush among the men. Land. As you approach the shoreline, you spy a small monastery in the distance. Stone buildings, humble cross, thatched roofs, clustered like gossiping hens. You're told the monks here make wine, chant hymns, and absolutely do not know how to fight. You adjust your helmet. It's more for intimidation than protection. It's got exaggerated cheek guards and no horns. Because, despite what cartoons say, real Vikings did not wear horned helmets unless it was Halloween or someone misread the saga. The longship glides onto the beach with surprising silence. Oars are pulled up. Footsteps crunch on wet pebbles. You hop out and squelch into the marshy sand. Your boots fill instantly with water. And a guy named Eric swears in Old Norse as his axe snags on a fishing net. You're not the first to raid these shores. In fact, you're following the infamous attack on Lindisfarne in 793, the raid that scared the quill off every monk in England. Contemporary chroniclers described it as the end of the world, full of heathen men who showed no respect for churches, relics, or the fact that monks don't usually carry swords. To be fair, you're here more for treasure and less for theology. The monastery is small, unguarded, and smells like turnip stew and beeswax. You burst through the doors, not with a scream, but with a carefully rehearsed battle howl that comes out sounding like a sneeze. Luckily, no one's judging. The monks scatter. A few drop scrolls. One just freezes with a candle in his hand. like a deer caught mid-prayer. You gather loot, mostly chalices, some silver plates, a reliquary that turns out to hold a suspiciously large toe, gold, a little, books, plenty, but paper doesn't buy mead. So you take the bindings and toss the rest. One monk tries to argue that it's the word of God, but your cousin replies, God can rewrite it if he wants it so badly. Scholars still debate whether the early raids were spontaneous freelance piracy or coordinated campaigns with political backing, given how often your leaders get into shouting matches over map directions. You're leaning toward freelance. As you sail away, you feel conflicted. You didn't kill anyone, but you did take a very nice cross and a sheep you're now responsible for. It stares at you. You name it Björn. It judges you. The wind is at your back. The coastline fades. No one's singing. Not yet. That comes later, when you're farther from the memories and closer to a tavern with strong drink and a weaker memory. For now, you sit with your damp cloak, your stolen sheep, and your racing thoughts. You realize Britain is not just a destination. It's the beginning of something bigger. Not just raids, not just burning villages and shouting in Old Norse, but settlements, kingdoms, cultural osmosis via axe. You glance at the stars, the same ones the monks pray under, the same ones guiding your voyage. You wonder, quietly, if you'll be back by morning. Your clothes are still damp. Your sheep is bleating softly, and the crew is already arguing over whether it was brave strategy or pure dumb luck that made last night's raid such a breeze. You chew on a strip of smoked fish that tastes like despair and sandalwood, and watch the coast recede further behind the ship's stern. But the thing is, you're not going back to Norway. Not yet, because what happened at Lindisfarne, thing that monks wrote about in shaking ink, the thing that had royal courts clutching their goblets, was just the beginning. Word spreads quickly when monasteries burn and gold goes missing. And now, more ships are coming. Not just yours. Not just your village. All of Scandinavia is packing up its oars and heading west like there's a Black Friday sale on abbeys. Lindisfarne was raided in 793 CE. Widely considered the first major Viking incursion into Britain, even though some smaller skirmishes probably happened earlier. It shocked the Christian world because, well, monasteries weren't exactly high-security zones. They were sacred, peaceful, and often absolutely loaded with gold, jewels, and manuscripts. Viking catnip. You weren't there at Lindisfarne technically, but every new raid is a rerun of that original episode, with slight local variations. Fewer relics here, more cows there, sometimes resistance. Often note, the monk scribes are starting to get really good at drawing panicked angels in boats with men holding axes. You consider starting a collection. What sets Lindisfarne apart isn't just that it happened, it's that it happened with such style. According to surviving accounts, the attackers weren't just brutal, they were precise. They arrived at dawn, caught everyone off guard, looted methodically, and vanished before anyone could react. It was the Viking equivalent of a well-reviewed heist movie, but you know the truth. Most of these guys are winging it. Plans are drawn in sand with sticks. Leaders are decided by who yells the loudest. And yet, here you are, changing the geopolitical map of Northern Europe, one monastery at a time. Historians still argue whether the early Viking raids were truly chaotic piracy or masked statecraft. Some believe the attacks were testing the waters literal and political for eventual settlement. Others think the Norse just had itchy oars and an appetite for shiny things. As you drift toward the coast of Northumbria, you start to see the pattern. The monks may pray to a forgiving God, but they're writing with vengeance in mind. Every raided town spawns a chronicle, a varning, a curse scrawled on parchment that may or may not survive the next raid. You read one aloud from a stolen book, and they came with fire and fury, beasts of the northern fog, unholy in word and weapon. You pause. Beasts of the northern fog? You look around. Do we count as fog? Someone throws a fish at you. It misses. Barely. You dock again near a smaller village. No monastery this time, but plenty of storage huts and at least one very nervous cow. You approach carefully, offering a trade of tools and beads. It's a gamble. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it ends in shouting. This time, it ends in something between a handshake and a stare down. You sleep that night in a borrowed barn, under hay that may or may not contain a sleeping chicken. Progress. By now, you've realized that raiding is just the first act. Settling comes next. Already, some of your crew are talking about staying, building, marrying. You hear whispers of land grants and carved runes left as territorial claims. You squint suspiciously at a piece of driftwood someone etched their name into. Is that legally binding? One fringe tidbit. Some Viking groups marked claimed territory with carved runestones long before building anything. These often referenced gods, ancestors, or insults toward anyone who dared move the rock. The next day, a different kind of surprise. A royal envoy arrives from a nearby Anglo-Saxon ruler knot with swords, but with food, bread, salted pork, a jug of mead, and a note. It reads, "Please go elsewhere." The queen signs it with what looks like a smiley face, but you suspect it's a stylized sun. You're not sure which is more threatening. You leave the village without looting. It feels weird, like finishing a song without a drum solo. Later, as the ship pushes off from the shore, you glance back at the villagers. One of them raises a hand knot in anger. Not in fear, just curiosity, and maybe a bit of exhausted resignation. It dawns on you that Britain isn't just scared of Vikings. It's learning from them, watching, adapting. The next time you come ashore, there may be walls, or spears, or contracts. Because once you break a door down, the next person tends to install a better lock. The longship creaks under your weight. As you settle into your seat, you think about Lindisfarne, about the monks, about the scroll you didn't burn, and the bread you shared with a farmer who didn't understand a word you said. You think about staying, not yet, but maybe soon. Your boots crunch through frost-kissed grass as you trudge inland, where the promise of more than loot begins to tug at your thoughts. This isn't a quick hit and run anymore. You're starting to see Norse faces in places they weren't before. You pass a cluster of smoky huts that smell like fish, stew, and burnt barley, and someone's tied a piece of driftwood over the door carved with runes, not Anglo-Saxon ones. These are yours. And that's when it hits you some of your crew never left. This isn't a raid. It's a relocation. You don't say it out loud. Of course, someone would throw a boot at your head. But the truth is sitting plain in front of you. You're not just taking from Britain anymore. You're planting roots. The sheep you stole 2 villages ago, she's got a name now. Freydis. You're weirdly attached. It's the 9th century. And Norse settlers are starting to stay. They bring tools, livestock, and perhaps most dangerous family, raiders become farmers. Axes are still within reach. But there are also thatched roofs, fire pits, and the occasional flirtatious glance from a local woman who definitely didn't invite you but isn't throwing you out either. You build. You trade. You argue over who gets to use the one decent cooking pot. Mainstream history often highlights the brutality of Viking raids. But what gets less airtime is the slow, stubborn shift toward settlement. Place like Dublin, York, and the Shetlands begin to fill with Norse-style homes and Norse-style problems, like whose goat chewed through the communal fence again. It's always Eric's goat. Always. One quirky tidbit. Some Norse settlers brought their own soap made with animal fat and ash, which horrified local Anglo-Saxons who thought daily washing was suspiciously vain. So yes, you're technically cleaner than the people you're conquering, and smug about it. Historians still argue whether the settlers always intended to claim land, or if it happened more organically one cold winter at a time, when returning home was harder than just staying. The reality was probably a mix. Some Norse leaders saw opportunity. Others just liked not freezing to death every night. As you explore further inland, you begin to notice something odd. Cooperation. Anglo-Saxon villages start trading with you. Tools for wool. Bread for iron. Even Josip. Passed awkwardly between languages. One man gestures to your axe, then to a tree, and you realize he's offering to help you fell it for a cut of the timber. You nod. Surprised. There's no blood, just bark, sweat, and shared silence. The days get colder, and you and a few others erect a proper longhouse near the edge of a village. It creaks at night. The thatch leaks. You wake up with mice in your boots. But still it's home. At least. For now, you start hearing whispers of laws. Who owns what? Who gets what share? Who owes whom a pig? It's chaos, but organized chaos. Some Norse jarls even begin marrying local nobles' daughters. Not always for love, but for land and leverage. You get the feeling that half of Viking conquest isn't done with swords, it's done with wedding rings and passive-aggressive dowries. One evening, you sit around a fire with locals and your own kin. You pass around a horn of mead and trade stories about sea monsters and cows that give too little milk. Someone tries to explain Christianity to you. You counter with tales of Odin hanging upside down from Yggdrasil. They stare. You smile. No one gets punched. It's all very suspicious. But it keeps happening. You find yourself learning local names, struggling through Anglo-Saxon words for plow and mud, and seriously, don't step there. You begin to blend, not vanish, just bluer, and that's when someone shows up from across the sea. A real Viking chieftain, with braided hair and polished armor and a voice that carries across mountains. He's not thrilled to find you planting barley and attending local festivals. "What happened to the plan?" he asks, chewing dried seal meat with contempt. "We're conquerors." And you shrug. "Have you tried the bread here?" He hasn't. Head does. He pauses, then asks for another slice. That night, the sky burns orange as someone hosts a feast under the stars. Not for conquest, not for victory, just for surviving another season in a land that's slowly becoming familiar. You drink too much. Someone sings out of tune. And Freydis the sheep eats half a floral wreath, someone left unattended. As you stagger to bed or something vaguely resembling it, you realize something profound. You didn't conquer Britain with fire. You're conquering it with time. You wake to the clatter of hooves and the screech of an unfamiliar bird, something between a goose and a demon with wings. The air smells like damp wood smoke and old cheese, which you assume means breakfast is happening somewhere. But today isn't just another sleepy village day. Today, the silver is getting buried. You wander toward the edge of the settlement, where a few of your crewmates are already digging in the frost-bitten earth. Their beards glisten with dew, their fingers clutching a small chest. Not a treasure chest. Mind you, just a plain wooden box. Half-rotted, iron nails rusted. But inside it clinks like magic. Silver coins, twisted bracelets, brooches, and one very suspiciously fancy spoon. You lean on your axe and sigh. Hoarding silver is a Viking pastime that rivals storytelling and petty feuds. When you can't spend it, show it off, or trade it without getting stabbed by jealous neighbors. You bury it. Somewhere only you, and maybe your cousin, who definitely talks in his sleep know. The Anglo-Saxons have started doing it too, thanks to your, let's say, economic disruptions. Entire hordes get buried in ceramic pots or cloth bundles, hastily hidden behind hearthstones or in tree hollows. You'd think it's because they fear theft. But really, they fear you. That you'll show up during morning prayers and say, "Nice chalice. Mind if we pillage?" The largest Viking hoards found in Britain, like the Quairdale hoard, weren't just storage. They were emergency savings accounts in the form of hacked silver, trade ingots, and jewelry melted into easily divisible chunks. Some scholars argue that these stashes weren't only for hiding, they were also about status. You didn't just own silver. You displayed that you had enough to lose some. You kneel beside the pit and inspect a coin. Anglo-Saxon mint. It gleams faintly. Someone jokes about cursing the hoard, so anyone who steals it gets boils. You laugh until you remember that's an actual thing. Half your crew still believes in trolls who steal shiny objects, unless you sprinkle blood on top. You make a mental note, not to mention that when dinner is served, historians still argue whether hoarding patterns map onto known raids or suggest internal panic and local power struggles. It's hard to tell. Every buried treasure comes with its own Silencino label. No diary. Just clues half swallowed by dirt and rain. Sometimes they're found centuries later by sheep. Seriously? One hoard was discovered because a sheep kept tripping over the same spot. After the box is hidden and the soil tamped down, you mark the spot with a bent branch and a stone in the shape of, well, it's vaguely bird-shaped if you squint. You whisper a quick charm to Thor, or to Freya, or maybe both. No one wants their savings stolen by ghosts. You walk back through the village, passing by huts and carts, and that one guy who's always sharpening his spear, even though no one's fighting today. There's a rhythm to life here now. Even with the unease, the raids are continuing elsewhere. But this settlement, it's become a weird fusion dish of Norse and Saxon lifelike. Someone made a stew with too many spices. But it somehow works. You help mend a fence. You argue over whether turnips or leeks make better stew. You help build a shrine that could belong to Odin, or maybe a very stern local saint. No one's sure anymore. And then, in the evening, Erona arrives, his tunics torn, his feet raw, his face pale. He brings news. More ships are coming. Not your kind. Not settlers. Raiders. The kind who didn't get the memo about peaceful integration and don't stab the farmer who sells you bread. You exhale through your nose. So much for quiet. There's talk of hiding again, of burying what you can't carry, of whether you even fight them off or let them pass through. This new wave might not care who already staked a claim or married a local noblewoman. You attend a meeting around a fire. Voices rise. Some want to send word to local Anglo-Saxon lords for help, a sentence you never imagined forming without sarcasm. Others say fight. A few suggest running. You sip your mead and quietly adjust your boots. Before sleep, you walk out to the burial site again. The soil's already settled. The stone marker looks ordinary. The treasure is there quiet, unseen, waiting for a future that may never come, or for a sheep with a very curious hoof. You sit under a sky the color of tarnished steel and wonder. Not for the first time. If this strange land of kings and monks and bad cheese is home now, or just another chapter in a saga that still has too many verses left. You hear them, before you see them, low horns rumbling through the fog, like some enormous, groaning beast rolling out of the sea. The ground vibrates beneath your boots, ever so slightly. It's not an earthquake. It's footsteps, many of them, and they're not yours. The great heathen army has arrived. And suddenly, your tidy little settlement, with its friendly goats and semi-cooperative neighbors, feels about as sturdy as a sandcastle in a tidal zone. The year is 865 CE. And you are no longer a pioneering settler. You're just another piece on a chessboard that's being upended by brothers with a vengeance streak and ships that stretch from one end of the coast to the other. Ivar, the Boneless. Halfdan Ragnarsson. Ubal, sons of Ragnar Lodbrok. Depending on whose saga you believe, and which storyteller had the least watered-down ale that day. These guys didn't come for trinkets or trade. They came to stay. And they brought an army so big, even the ravens look overwhelmed. They call it the Great Heathen Army. But don't let the flair fool you. It's not one tidy legion in matching uniforms. It's more like a Viking family reunion with battle axes and an aggressive interest in real estate. Some of them are here to avenge their father's legendary execution by King Ella of Northumbria, rumored to involve a pit of snakes. Though historians still argue whether that poetic image was a metaphor or a creative flourish from later writers trying to sell more scrolls. You trudge alongside them for a while, your boots falling in rhythm with theirs. These aren't the scruffy raiders you remember from the early days. These are hardened fighters. Some, even with battlefield ranks. There's a loose chain of command, mostly consisting of who can shout orders, the loudest, or wear the biggest cloak without tripping over it. Discipline is, flexible. As you move inland, towns begin to crumble before you even get there. Word spreads fast. The army is enormous, relentless, and somehow organized. Monasteries empty out before you arrive. Fortified towns surrender rather than risk burning. One village even greets you with a table of roast pork, as if hoping to bribe their way into being ignored. It works, mostly because the pork is fantastic. And then comes York. York called Eoforwic back then, though no one agrees on how to pronounce it without sounding like you're sneezing. A Roman ghost town turned Anglo-Saxon city, full of twisting alleys and defensive walls that haven't seen action since sandals were fashionable. It becomes the new Viking capital. More or less. You help rebuild some walls. You help burn others. You sip a local drink that tastes like regret and boiled fruit, and wonder what comes next. Because make no mistake, this isn't just conquest anymore. It's a pivot point. From raiders to rulers. From horror stories to historical forces, the great heathen army is carving up the island like a roast, taking a chunk of East Anglia here, a slice of Northumbria there. Kings fall, fortresses crumble, parchments get updated with new names. Yours. One fringe detail? The army may have had war banners featuring ravens symbolic of Odin, and possibly designed to psychologically unnerve the enemy. Some tales say the banners could predict victory, based on how they fluttered. Others say that's just what you tell people when the wind changes direction. You sleep that night in a commandeered hall, sharing space with warriors, pigs, and one guy who won't stop recounting how many throats he's metaphorically slit. You toss and turn, trying not to inhale too deeply, because hygiene still isn't anyone's strong suit, but you're restless. The power is intoxicating. Yes, but so is the uncertainty. You remember the quiet before the army came, the brittle peace you built like a crooked fence. You wonder what happens to those promises now. There's talk of dividing England, not just looting, atoning it, turning it into something else. Something Norse-ish. You hear the word Danelaw whispered, like a prophecy. A region not merely raided, but governed under Viking laws, customs, and an alarming number of meat-based stews. The thought curls in your mind like smoke from an unfamiliar fire. You didn't sign up to be a politician. But here you are, memorizing borders and arguing over tax rates on piglets. The next day, you join a small scouting party. Your boots squish through marshland, past ruined villages, abandoned prayer stones, and the occasional angry farmer who throws a clump of wet grass in your direction. You laugh it off until the grass hits your face and you momentarily lose your balance in a ditch. But in that mud, you see something shining. Not treasure, just a brooch. Half buried. Anglo-Saxon. Likely dropped in haste. It's shaped like a bird. Maybe a dove. You clean it off and pocket it. Not for value. Just as a reminder of everything being swept away. You return to York as the sun bleeds across the sky. Fires flicker in the distant cenote raids this time. Just cooking hearths. New homes being built. People adjusting to this strange new order. You realize something startling. You might never leave. You're ankle deep in a swamp. And this is not how heroes are supposed to live. Mud oozes into your boots. Frogs eye you suspiciously from soggy logs. And your last piece of dry bread has turned into something that could legally qualify as a sponge. You sigh and trudge forward, hoping the king you're here to support has at least figured out how to boil water by now. His name is Alfred. You've heard of him, scrawny, clever, fond of books and prayers. Not exactly the Viking slaying, axe-swinging type, but desperation does strange things to men. And Alfred, for all his oddities, is about to become something the Vikings never expected, an actual threat. It's the late 870s now. The great heathen army has carved England into puzzle pieces, and Wessex is the last one left standing. Just barely. Alfred's had to flee his royal hall more than once, slipping through shadows and swapping crowns for cloaks. The most famous story? He hides in the marshes of Athelney and gets scolded by a peasant woman for burning her cakes. You picture him, their future king, savior of the Anglo-Saxons, staring sadly at a charred biscuit. It's weirdly comforting. Historians still argue whether that cake tale is real or metaphorical. But either way, it sticks. Because this is the turning point. Alfred doesn't disappear into legend. He regroups, has strategizes. He adapts. You meet him well. Sort of. You're with a band of Norse who are now unsure where they stand. Some of your comrades have been in Britain so long. They're part Anglo themselves. You find yourselves hired by, traded to, or occasionally defecting toward Alfred. Because the line between Viking and enemy of the Vikings is now blurry. Morality has taken a nap. Survival is the new religion. Alfred, for all his modesty, is no fool. He starts organizing militias, known as fyrds, who rotate between farming and fighting. He builds fortified townsburghs that you hate attacking because they're annoyingly efficient. He even invests in a navy, which is either adorable or terrifying, depending on how much you fear small boats captained by monks with grudges. More shocking? Alfred promotes literacy. You're barely literate in runes. And here's this king, encouraging people to read and write in their own language. He translates Latin works into Old English and expects his nobles to do their homework. You try to imagine your crew doing a book club and burst out laughing. And yet, it works. Wessex holds. More than that, it pushed back. You're sent with a raiding party to test one of the new burghs, expecting an easy sack and go. What you get is a wall full of archers, a locked gate, and a lot of angry farmers who suddenly fight like trained soldiers. You barely make it out with your shield. And even that now has a suspicious dent, shaped exactly like someone's boot. The great heathen army begins to fracture. Some Viking leaders head north. Others die sometimes gloriously, often just from infected cuts or stew-related incidents. You return to your longhouse, where the roof leaks slightly less than last month, and find yourself wondering if this is the end of expansion. The tide is shifting. One quirky detail: Alfred kept a book of prayers on him, even in battle, tucked under his tunic. Some say he believed it protected him. Others that it kept his spine straight. Either way, no one dared mock it after he started winning. By the early 880s, Alfred negotiates a treaty with Guthrum, a Viking leader who agrees to convert to Christianity as part of the peace deal. You're there at the baptism. It's a tense, awkward ceremony with wet hair, forced smiles, and a lot of sideways glances. Someone jokes that the water might hiss if it touches Viking skin. It doesn't, but Guthrum flinches. And that's enough to make the moment legendary. You retreat back into Norse territory that night, nursing a twisted ankle and a heart full of mixed signals. The fighting's not over. But something fundamental has changed. The Anglo-Saxons aren't just surviving. They're innovating. And you're starting to feel old as you sit by the fire, sharpening your blade out of habit. A young boy from the settlement approaches. He points at your axe and asks if you'll teach him to fight. You raise an eyebrow. Why, you ask? Because the next war's coming, he says. Like it's just the weather. You stare at the fire and nod slowly. The kid's probably right. But tonight, your boots are off. The stew is hot, and no one's storming the gate. For now, you're sitting at a table made from an old door, sharing dried fish with a man who may or may not have tried to stab you last spring. The air smells of boiled onions, burned ole, and vague suspicion. On the wall behind you hangs a peace treaty, if you can call it, that's scribbled on stretched parchment, sealed with a crooked blob of wax that looks more like someone sneezed than signed. This, apparently, is diplomacy now. It's the 880s, and your warband has started wearing boots instead of soaking in blood every morning. Not because you've suddenly embraced pacifism, but because it turns out conquering a land is easier than figuring out how to run it. The lines between Viking and Anglo-Saxon have blurred like ink in a rainstorm. You're eating their food, speaking their language badly, and trying not to violate the latest ceasefire, which changes every time someone drinks too much and accidentally raids a neighbor's goat shed. These treaties are endless. You remember the one between Alfred and Guthrum, full of place names even the locals can't pronounce, and boundaries marked by rivers that move slightly every year. There are terms about hostages, about religious conversion, about trado, and an agreement that Guthrum will be Alfred's godson. Because why not make it weird? Historians still argue whether these treaties were genuine peace efforts or just breathing space between bloodshed. Either way, they require you to pretend not to hate each other in public. Privately, well, you still sharpen your axe just in case. Your job lately has involved less pillaging and more posturing. You're sent with a small group to negotiate a supply exchange: grain for iron, wool for salt. The Anglo-Saxon then, you're supposed to meet, brings a translator, even though you both speak the same language now, just with wildly different accents and occasional insults disguised as compliments. He hands you a bundle of parchment. You squint. The script loops in too many directions. You flip it over, hoping it'll suddenly make sense upside down. It doesn't. You nod anyway and hand over your own, contract a carved stick with notches that indicate 5 sacks of barley and do not stab. Oh, you seal the deal with mead. Bad mead. Mead that tastes like fermented regret. But you both drink. And that counts. There's a new type of settlement forming, part Norse, part Saxon. People are marrying across lines, trading sheep, arguing about whose god is better at healing boils. You attend a feast in one of these hybrid towns and try to follow the rules. Don't bring weapons. Don't insult the host's beard. Don't comment on how bland the bread is. You fail on the third rule. The host glares. You explain that in the north. Bread is supposed to fight back when you bite it. He doesn't laugh. Still. The feast goes on. Someone brings out a harp. Someone else recites a saga. You notice how many words from Old Norse are creeping into their song's husband. Clife. Egg. Anglo-Saxon tongues are changing. You smirk. Language is the softest invasion of all. Later that week, you ride with a mixed patrol, half Danes, half Saxons. Your horses snort in unison. The trail is quiet. The air crisp. You spot something glinting in the grass, a coin, dropped by a traveler or left as an offering. You pick it up. The king's face on one side, a cross on the other. You slip it into your pouch, unsure if it's worth anything or just sentimental. A fellow rider leans over. Another treaty tomorrow? He mutters. You grunt. What's this one about? Borders. Again. Didn't we already settle that? He shrugs. New border. New argument. Oh, that night. Back in your hall. You sit beneath a leaky roof and patch your cloak with thread dyed from onion skins. You think about all the places you've raided, all the people you've scared, all the kings who tried to kill or convert you, and here you are eating porridge, arguing over parchment, and debating whether to plant barley or oats this season. It's not glorious, but it's life. The next morning, you ride to the treaty meeting. This one takes place under a massive oak tree, surrounded by bored-looking warriors and scribes trying to keep their scrolls from blowing away. You recognize one of the Anglo-Saxon elders. She once tried to drown you in a river. Now he offers you cheese. You accept. It's terrible, but the gesture is appreciated. The treaty goes long. Too many chiefs. Not enough translators. At one point, someone draws a map in the dirt. Another person accidentally steps on it, erasing half of Mercia. You sigh and redraw it with your boot. By sundown, there's a vague agreement in place. Something about trade routes and shrine access and how many pigs can be taxed per village. No one's thrilled. But everyone's tired. Which, frankly, is the closest thing to peace you've seen in years. As you ride home, a child runs alongside your horse for a few steps, waving a reed spear and shouting something heroic. You wave back. It's oddly touching. You realize treaties aren't just about leaders. They're about giving kids like that a chance to play pretend instead of burying real weapons in the mud. You pull your cloak tighter. The wind smells like winter. And for once, you're not afraid of it. You wake up to the sound of hammering. Not swords on shields this time, but wood on wood beams rising. Roofs being fixed. Doors being carved instead of kicked in. This is Danelaw now. And while the name sounds like it should come with thunder and a dramatic drumbeat, it's mostly just laws. Lots of laws. And more pigs than you'd like to admit. The land has been divided. Northern and Eastern England, roughly a third of the Holies under Norse control. Places like East Anglia, Northumbria, parts of Mercia. They've drawn lines. Some real, some imaginary. And for once, those lines aren't covered in blood. You're living under Danish rule now. And somehow that means your neighbor is both your trading partner and your unofficial rival in whose goats are cleaner. Danelaw isn't just a name. It's a way of life that feels surprisingly domestic. You expected more raiding, more burning, more epic poetry being shouted over flames. Instead, you're watching kids play in the dirt outside a timber-framed law court, where disputes are settled not by blades, but by something called a Thinga Public Assembly, where free men argue about fences, stolen chickens, and who owns that rock near the stream. Historians still argue whether Danelaw functioned as a proper legal system or more like organized chaos in fur cloaks. But for you, it means fewer surprise ambushes and more awkward public oaths involving livestock. You help build a longhouse with your neighbors. It smells like pine and old sweat. The roof's steep to shed rain quickly, and there's a smoke hole in the center where the fire pit hisses like it's annoyed at everything. You hang your cloak on a peg and realize you haven't cleaned blood off it in weeks. That's progress. Markets are popping up. Yorno called Jorvikis bustling. You head there once a month, bumping shoulders with traders from as far as the Frankish coast. Quine clink. Spices drift on the wind, and someone always seems to be yelling about fish. You buy a comb carved from antler and a sweet cake that nearly cracks your tooth. Totally worth it. You notice something odd. The Anglo-Saxon villagers have started copying your hairstyles. Meanwhile, your people are wearing woolen tunics with unfamiliar embroidery. Cultures aren't clashing. They're blending. Like someone stirred the stew too long and now can't separate the carrots from the barley. One afternoon, you visit a temple. Not a Christian one. This one's small, built from reclaimed stones, with a carved wooden Thor hammer hung at the entrance. It's quiet. Inside, a woman lights a tallow candle and mutters something under her breath, maybe a prayer. Maybe just a complaint about how cold it is. You sit for a moment and feel something strange. Not fear, not faith, just continuity. You wander the outskirts of town and see runestones, rising flat stones carved with memorials. You run your fingers over the spiraling inscriptions. Some praise the dead. Others warn the living. A few are just glorified name tags for rich people who wanted to be remembered. But they feel important, permanent. You help a blacksmith shoe a horse. Not because you're particularly skilled, but because he's short a hand and long on sarcasm. He lets you pump the bellows and tells you stories of old battles while sparks fly like angry bees. You don't tell him you were probably on the other side of one of those fights. It doesn't matter anymore. That night, someone sings in the hall. A blend of languages, half-rhymed, barely melodic, but it makes your fingers twitch like they're remembering a tune. You hum along. Off-key. No one minds. The quirky tidbit? In this new hybrid society, Norse and Saxon legal customs begin to merge. For example, instead of trial by combat, there's growing preference for oath-taking. Get enough respectable people to swear you didn't steal that goat, and you're in the clear. It's essentially early peer review, but with more chickens present. You watch two men argue over grazing rights. It escalates fast, but instead of violence, it ends with both of them paying fines and shaking hands like disappointed uncles. You didn't see that coming. You also didn't see how quickly you're adjusting to this not killing people lifestyle. But it's not all peaceful. There's tension. Always. Some settlements resent Norse rule. Others embrace it. You hear rumors of Alfred's son Edward consolidating power in the south. Another tide is coming. But not today. Today, you patch your roof, sharpen your farming tools, and teach a boy how to trap rabbits without falling into the pit himself. You tell him to listen for the birds when they go quiet. Something's wrong. He nods, wide-eyed, then falls into the pit anyway. You laugh and help him out. Both of you covered in leaves and pride. As dusk settles, the village hums with small noises, crackling fires, clinking pots, murmured stories. You lie on your straw bed, staring up at the beams above, carved with dragons and birds, and that weird symbol your cousin swears wards off bad dreams. You trace it with your eyes and wonder not what comes next, but how long this strange peace will last. How long before the lines shift again, before someone decides they don't like the treaty, or the taxes, or the bread? But tonight, it's quiet. Tonight, you sleep under a roof you helped raise, in a land that's neither fully Viking nor fully Saxon, but something in between, something new. You follow the scent of something halfway between roasted pork and mildew, and it leads you straight into the heart of Jorvik. Note York, Jorvik. The Viking stronghold turned bustling, messy, wonderfully chaotic town. It's got narrow streets that force strangers into intimate conversations, gutters that double as both sewers and warning systems, and market stalls so dense they might start merging into one giant pickled herring stand if no one stops them. The ground is a spongy mixture of mud, straff, and regret. You try not to look down too much. It squelches. Enough said. Your boots stick slightly as you pass a weaver's booth, where a woman with forearms like tree trunks is flogging wool, dyed in colors that only exist in sunsets and questionable dreams. She tries to upsell you on a scratchy tunic, claims it's royal grade. You remind her that you're more likely to fall face, first in a dung heap than into a throne. She grins. You buy the tunic anyway. This is what peace looks like: traders shouting in 4 different dialects, dogs chasing pigs, and some unfortunate child loudly vomiting into a rain barrel. You love it here. But there's still the scent. It's not just the fish stalls or unwashed bodies or mystery stew. It's the smell of humanity jammed into tight wooden structures without much interest in hygiene. A mainstream historical fact, archaeological digs centuries later would uncover layers of compacted waste, hair combs, lice, shoes, and even a petrified onion. One scholar called it a time capsule of communal filth. And you're living right in the middle of it. Quirky side note, people here use moss as toilet paper. Not the worst idea until it's winter, and the moss freezes into something that could chip a tooth. Still, you adapt. You learn to navigate the alleys by sound tanneries hiss, smithies ring, and someone always seems to be arguing over chickens. You duck into a bakery where the bread is a bit burnt, but still better than the combat loaves you used to eat in the field. The baker's son offers you a sticky bun with too much honey. You accept. Life's short. Back outside. You watch a performance near the Fountina Scald, retelling the tale of Ragnar Lodbrok, with way too much flair, and at least one historical inaccuracy per sentence. You nod approvingly. Nothing like a dramatic retelling to make people forget they're standing next to a puddle that may or may not be alive. As evening sets in, you help repair a roof tile on your cousin's house. It's not even your house. But in Jorvik, repairs are communal. Everyone knows that if one roof leaks, it leaks on everyone, eventually figuratively and literally. You pass him the hammer, nearly fall through the rafters, and share a laugh, while a neighbor below shouts about dust in his stew. Later, you wander to the edge of town, where the fields begin. The boundary between city and farmland is abrupt 1 minute. It's noise and chaos. The next, it's wind and wheat. You spot a group of kids daring each other to chase geese. One brave soul tries and is immediately punished by the largest, angriest goose you've ever seen. You nod in silent respect. You stroll back through the town gate, where a pair of watchmen half-heartedly check for weapons. One of them is carving something into a wooden postrunes that spell out either a protection spell or his name, depending on who you ask. The scholarly debate? Some argue these rune markings served as civic records, while others think they were simply graffiti. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Inside, Jorvik glows with torchlight and low voices. The smells are stronger now: wood smoke, sweat, ale, and the ever-present undercurrent of fish. You find a quiet corner of the hall. You now call home and settle onto your bedroll. The walls are covered in hangings, made by your neighbor's wife, she claims. They ward off ill dreams. Judging by the wild boar motif, they may actually invite them in. Someone starts singing. Someone else joins in. Before long, the whole hall is humming a tune you half recognize, half forgot. It's old, maybe even older than your sword. You smile in the dark. The noise of the city is oddly comforting now. It's the sound of people trying to live instead of just survive. Of children learning to count by tracking how many rats scurry past the doorstep. Of merchants arguing over whether dried eel is superior to smoked trout. Of townspeople gathering at dawn to argue fines and fence lines in the town square. And of you, for once, not sharpening a blade before bed. You think back to the raids, the cold, the violence, the burning churches and stolen chalices, and you wonder how this place became your home. Not through conquest, not entirely, but through persistence, through the realization that maybe stability is more impressive than domination. As you fall asleep, the distant clang of a forge lulls you, not the rhythm of war drums anymore, but of roof nails and horseshoes and market weights. The old world's still out there, beyond the walls, but for tonight, Jorvik hus. You're ankle deep in pig slop, elbow deep in negotiations, and fully submerged in the awkward new reality of Viking life in Britain. Conquest used to be the easy part: storm the beach, burn the monastery, sail away with treasure and tales. Now, you're trying to figure out how many bushels of barley equal one rusty plowshare, while arguing with a Saxon elder who insists on quoting laws older than your grandfather's toenail. The year is pushing into the 890s. The sun still rises, like it's surprised to be back. And your village still smells like a mixture of stew, smoke, and ambition. This is life under Danelaw. And you're no longer a raider. You're something worse: responsible. You've been elected to the local thing, a Norse public assembly where disputes are settled. Laws are made. and men who hate each other are forced to sit in a circle pretending they didn't fight over a cow last week. You stand under the old ash tree, its roots more stable than half the roofs in the village. And listen, as your neighbor accuses your cousin of stealing firewood. Again, you sigh. Again, one mainstream historical fact: Norse assemblies were more democratic than you'd think free men could speak, vote, and even argue for law changes, assuming they weren't too drunk or stabbed mid-sentence. A fringe detail? Some things were outlawed entirely, in speech like using metaphors to hide insults. That didn't stop anyone. Of course. You once heard a man call someone a saggy sheep bladder dressed like pride. And no one blinked. As part of the thing, you're also expected to enforce the new mixed legal code, half Norse, half Anglo-Saxon, and entirely a headache. One part demands compensation for property damage. The other insists on something called wergild, a man price. So when someone's goat goes missing, it turns into a full legal proceeding involving 3 witnesses, a blood oath, and a slightly terrified goat herder who forgot which pen he used. You ride from village to village now, settling disputes. Not because you're wise, absolutely not, but because you're neutral enough to not get stabbed during deliberations. Mostly. One man throws a turnip at you. You duck. The goat behind you does not. This morning, you visit a small settlement near the river half, rebuilt after a flood. The other half arguing over where the fence should be. A woman named Aethelgifu insists her chickens have ancestral rights to peck on both sides. You don't know how to argue with that. You suggest a shared pen. She calls you a soft-handed invader. You take it as a compliment. Historians still argue whether the Danelaw's administrative structure was truly functional or held together by sheer stubbornness and mutual exhaustion. From where you stand, it's both. People want order, but they don't want rules. They want justice, but only when it favors them. You want to go back to simpler times, but you also enjoy having bread that isn't stolen. In the evenings, you write things down. Not full sentences, just runes. Tally marks. Strange little symbols that help you remember who owes what. Your cousin mocks your parchment habit. You turning into a monk now? He jeers. You respond by charging him 3 silver for last week's borrowed axe. Hes stops mocking. The villages are evolving. There are more stone buildings now. Not just timber and daub. Wells with actual covers. Roads that almost deserve the title. Children run through the market yelling in hybrid phrase, half Old Norse, half Saxon. You hear one shout something that sounds like, "Get your boots off the barley, dunghead." And you feel strangely proud. A traveling skald visits your hall one night, telling tales of Harold Fairhair and Eric Bloodaxe. The younger folk hang on every word. You sit back, mug in hand, and wonder if those tales still mean anything to kids who have never crossed the sea, who've only known farms, feasts, and the occasional tax riot. You think about the gods. You used to pray before battle, offer meat and iron at the stones. Now, you mumble half-remembered blessings before arbitration sessions. It's hard to know if Thor cares whether a cart ran over someone's goose. Maybe he does. Maybe that's why the wheel broke. One odd bit of trivia: in some communities, they started mixing religious symbol crosses and hammers carved side by side, hedging their bets. You see one such carving on the lintel of a granary. You touch it absent-mindedly as you pass. Feels rough. Feels real. Late one night, a dispute breaks out over a shared well. The neighbors shout. You show up with a torch, half asleep, and accidentally resolve the issue by falling into the well. They laugh. You get soaked. But after that, they build a second well together. Problem solved. Painful, but solved. You wonder what it means to belong now. You came here as an invader, a foreigner, a feared face beneath a helmet. And now, here you are, soaked to the bone, and being offered warm bread by a woman whose husband once fought against your cousin. People change. Villages change. Even you change. And though there's talk in the air rumors of Saxon kings rising again, of new wars, stirring it all feels distant tonight. You hang your cloak by the hearth and warm your feet near the coals. Someone hands you a bowl of stew with too much garlic and not enough meat. But you eat it anyway. You've had worse. You've been worse. And as you drift off, parchment and pebbles spread before you in tomorrow's legal plan. You find yourself wondering less about conquest and more about continuity. The smell of sea air reaches you before the sails do. Salty, biting, heavy with old memories. You stand at the edge of a low cliff, squinting at the horizon, watching narrow black ships carve lines through the foam. Longships, Viking longships. But not yours this time. Not comrades. Not raiders returning home with loot and bad stories. No, these are strangers. Danes, from across the sea. Norwegians, maybe. Newer waves of would-be conquerors. Eyes glinting with hunger and nostalgia for a war you've grown tired of. You turn back toward your village, where a boy is chasing a chicken with a ladle. The hammering of roof repairs echoes in the background. Peace is fragile. Like an overcooked biscuit, it looks solid. Until someone pokes it. The newcomers don't attack immediately. They camp nearby, just out of arrow range, hoisting their flags and waiting. They want tribute, or territory, or both. The king and the South Alfred's son Edwardus, watching closely. He's been pushing north, nibbling at Danelaw's edges, trying to stitch England back together under a single crown. You've seen his messengers in the villages, soft-spoken, sharp-eyed, offering parchment deals backed by steel. Historians still argue whether Edward's conquest was a unifying project or simply a well-dressed land grab. Either way, it's squeezing your people like wine from a press-slow. Relentless. Messy. The new Vikings don't know that. They think it's still 865. That monasteries are still fat and undefended. That England is weak. You walk into the town hall, where the thing is already gathering. Voices rise. Should you negotiate? Threaten? Flee? Your cousin suggests poisoning their stew. No one's entirely sure if he's joking. Probably not. You're appointed to lead the delegation, because you've got the least enemies and the most complete set of teeth. Also, because your boots don't squeak, which is surprisingly important in diplomacy. You ride out at dawn. A small group of elders behind you, bearing bread, salted fish, and 3 silver armbands as a gift. You find the newcomers sharpening weapons. Their leader wears a wolf pelt and stares like he's calculating how much your head weighs. You offer the bread first. He takes it, chews, then spits into the grass. Not a great start. The negotiations are short. They want land fertile, coastal, defensible. You don't have any of that left. You offer trade instead. They laugh. One of them calls your people soft-bellied farmers playing Jarl. That one, you note, has a limp. You file it away. You return that evening and gather the town. No fighting yet. But it's coming. You see it in the way people sharpen tools that haven't been weapons in years. In the way old men stand a little straighter, as if willing their spines to remember war. In the way children are told bedtime stories that start with, "If they break the door." You run. Oh. Mainstream fact. The early 900s saw increasing Viking activity across the British Isles. But unlike before, the newer invaders met organized resistance and even betrayal by other Norse who had already settled. In other words, the Vikings had become the defenders. You spend the next days fortifying. The old earth wall around the village is patched up, ditches dug, traps reset. You find an old shield buried behind the smithy. Its edge rotted, but still better than bare hands. You test its balance. Not bad. A scout returns with news. The newcomers have split half heading inland, half moving south. Testing, probing, classic raiding patterns. But they're not ready for coordinated towns with warning systems and defensive plans. They think you're still disorganized. They're wrong. The attack comes at dawn 3 days later. Not at your village, but the next one over. You ride there with a handful of others. Arrows tucked into your belt. Breath fogging in the morning chill. The smoke's visible from the ridge, curling up like a snake, trying to uncoil. You arrive to chaos screaming. Broken carts. Blood on thatch. But also resistance. Spears forming lines. Axes flashing in the sun. You jump in without thinking, parrying a blade with the edge of your shield, slipping in the mud and catching someone's elbow with your face. Glorious, quirky aside. One village woman hurls beehives from her rooftop. The invaders scatter. No one wants war bees. The fighting doesn't last long. The newcomers break. Not used to opposition. Not used to traps. Coordination. Villagers fighting like they've got fields to lose. You help drag the wounded to a barn. Offer water. Patch wounds with linen that still smells like cabbage. One man cries quietly, not from pain, but from relief. You sit beside him and feel something odd. Pride. This is your home now, and you defended it. That night, the survivors feast. It's not much boiled root vegetables and ale that tastes like regret, but it's shared. A boy asks if you'll tell the story of what happened today. You laugh and tell him no one wants to hear about you slipping in pig mud while dodging an axe. He insists. You start telling it anyway. As the fire crackles, someone suggests sending a warning to the next villages. You volunteer. Your horse is slow, but you know the roads. You pack bread, a knife, and a carved rune token for luck. The journey won't be easy, but you've done worse. As you ride out under a full moon, the land feels quiet, but not weak. Every fence post, every torch-lit gatehouse, every soot-smudged child asleep in a straw bed behind you, they all remind you what's at stake. And why. Even now. You're still willing to fight. The age of raiding may be ending. But the story isn't over. Not by a long shot. You wake up stiff, sore, and with a goose pecking your boot. Not metaphorically an actual goose. Apparently offended by your presence near its turf. You mutter an apology and offer a crumb of bread, which it accepts like royalty, then waddles away with the air of a duchess insulted by your peasantry. Just another morning in post-raid Britain. The sun's not quite up yet. But the village is stirring. The blacksmith's hammer rings before the rooster crows. A dog barks, like it's arguing with ghosts. You pull your cloak tighter and shuffle toward the stable, where your horse still unnamed after 3 years because nothing's felt quite right chews on straw like it's chewing through its taxes. You give it a pat and climb into the saddle, the chill biting through your tunic like nosy gossip. You've got a long ride ahead. The next village south is 2 days by hoof. Assuming no flooded bridges or Saxon toll traps along the way, you carry a carved rune rod marked with the seal of the local thing, meaning you're on official business warning settlements of hostile newcomers, negotiating mutual defense, and possibly scoring a free meal or two if you sound tired enough. You're very good at sounding tired. Along the way, the landscape unfolds like a soggy tapestry. Mossy fences, sheep, blinking, like they've seen too much. Muddy fields dotted with stubborn turnips. A man with no pants is chasing a cart that's rolled away with his cabbages. You nod solemnly as you pass. Some battles are too personal to interrupt. Mainstream historical fact. During this period of the early 10th century, alliances between Norse settlers and Anglo-Saxons were forming out of mutual necessity. Viking villages that had once sworn loyalty to Danish kings began coordinating with English rulers to fight off newer, more chaotic invasions, some from other Norse, others from Irish or Welsh mercenaries. The irony isn't lost on you. You arrive at the village of Grimwald's Edge by nightfall. It's a modest, place 3 halls. One burnt down recently, and a suspicious number of goats who appear to have unionized. The local reeve meets you with a suspicious squint and a ladle. You hand over the rune rod and your credentials, and he relaxes only slightly. Hospitality rules say he must feed you, but nothing says he has to smile about it. They give you a bench by the hearth and something they call stew, but you suspect once had feathers. You eat it anyway. A boy sits beside you and stares. You offer him the last hunk of bread, and he nods like you've just promoted him to Jarl. That night, you gather the elders in a long hall that leaks more than it shelters. You lay out the news raiders spotted up the coast. One village burned. Another defended. You recommend preparation, reinforce fences, store food, sharpen blades. Maybe avoid insulting any passing monks. One woman asks if they should flee. You say only if they want to return to nothing. It's a harsh answer, but honest. Historians still argue whether these smaller communities truly believed they could resist alone, or if they were just buying time for the stronger settlements to survive. But you've seen determination in muddy boots and pitchforks sharpened out of necessity. Sometimes survival isn't logical, it's stubborn. In the morning, you're gifted a wheel of questionable cheese and a small bronze brooch shaped like a fish. You're not sure if it's decorative or symbolic, but you wear it anyway. Every bit helps. The ride to the next village is rougher. You pass through a forest where the trees lean like they're whispering secrets. A crow follows you for an hour. You name it, King pecks a lot. It seems unimpressed. You camp in a ruined watchtower halfway there, roasting an onion over a tiny fire, and wondering how you became someone who carries onions around like treasure. Maybe this is what growing up looks like. The second village, Stow Hollowes. Already preparing when you arrive. Word travels fast. They've begun digging a ditch and building a crude palisade. Children are stacking stones like miniature fortress architects. The reeve here greets you warmly and offers something called victory soup. It's mostly garlic and ego. You share your observations, offer advice, and show them how to reinforce a gate with planks. They listen. They work. They care. It's strange, seeing people trust you now. You used to be a raider. Now you're a guide. Life's weird like that. As night falls, there's music. A man with a harp sings an old Norse song that morphs midway into an English folk tune. The hall joins in. Voices uncertain, but warm. You hum along, not recognizing the words, but feeling the shape of them. Comfort, resilience, home. A girl offers you a woven bracelet she made from dyed straw. You thank her and tie it around your wrist, next to your scarred leather cuff. You've never looked more like a contradiction. Before dawn, you ride on. You've got more villages to warn, more routes to scout, more stories to collect. The brooch, the bracelet, the questionable cheese, they jangle slightly as you go, like a jester with too many responsibilities. And as your horse plods forward under a pale sky, you realize something. You're not delivering warnings anymore. You're delivering connection. Reminders that the villages are not alone, that someone still rides between them, that the story isn't just about who swings the sword but who dares to keep showing up. Your legs are tired. Your horse is grumpy. And your cheese wheel is beginning to smell like it's plotting something. But you press on, because that's what messengers do in a land teetering between shaky peace and soggy chaos. You cross a crumbling Roman road that still clings to relevance. Its stones, poking through mud, like the bones of a forgotten empire. The sky can't decide if it wants to rain or pout. And a breeze keeps flapping your cloak into your face like a dramatic stage curtain. The village of Wolfham is your next stop. It sits on a slope, framed by sheep pastures and one unfortunate hill that seems to erode faster than they can rebuild it. You arrive to a tense scene house at the gate. 3 men arguing over who owns a fence that clearly belongs to neither Achin. The reeve breaks it up with a wooden spoon and a death glare. You wait patiently, petting your horse and wondering if fences are truly worth this much grief. Inside the hall, you're ushered to the fire where a bowl of suspicious porridge awaits you. It smells faintly of defeat and burnt oats. But you smile and eat. You've had worse. You've been worse. You deliver your news again, raiders, to the east. Allied villages defending together. Need for scouts and preparation. The elders nod grimly. But you can feel the fatigue. These people have heard too many warnings and seen too few results. They want certainty. And all you can offer is a map scribbled with arrows and hope. One mainstream fact: by the early 10th century, communication between villages relied heavily on personal networks, messengers like you who rode, walked, or even rode across countryside to warn others. There were no official postal systems. just determined humans carrying news and stale bread. That night, you stay with an old couple who offer you a spot in their loft. It smells of straw, onions, and dried fish. But the blankets are warm, and the snoring dog curled at your feet makes it feel almost luxurious. Before sleep, the old man tells you how his grandfather saw the great heathen army land, how he hid in a haystack for 3 days while warriors looted the monastery. You ask if he still fears Vikings. He shrugs and says, "These days, we all just want someone who fixes the well and doesn't burn the turnips." In the morning, you're gifted a pair of woolen socks. They don't match, but they're warmer than anything you've worn in weeks. You wear them proudly. You've officially become a connoisseur of humble gifts bracelets. Cheese. Socks. At this rate, you'll be buried in a treasure hoard that smells like a pantry. Your next stop is not a village, but a gathering, a thing-an open-air meeting of Norse and Saxon leaders, halfway between 2 settlements, under a stand of gnarled oak trees that look like they've seen a dozen betrayals and a few awkward hugs. The crowd is mixed men and women in cloaks of wool and fur, some with swords, others with scrolls, and everyone with opinions. You take your place among the listeners as a Norse elder stands to speak. He's tall, wide, and missing his left ear claims, he gave it to Odin as a joke. He proposes a pact of mutual defense, a sharing of scouts and signal fires, a system to track raiders as they move inland. A Saxon man, counter-suspicious of Norse intentions, worried about split loyalties. The tension feels thick enough to stew. You step forward. You speak. Not with fire, but with weariness. You recount the villages you've seen. The children learning 2 languages. The goats who now ignore whether their herders are named Edric or Bjorn. You talk about the raiders, how they don't care who prays to which godly, who has grain to steal and homes to burn. Your words aren't eloquent, but they're real. And real things land harder than polished ones. Historians still argue whether these meetings led directly to organized regional defense or were just symbolic. But in this moment, you feel something shift. Hands are shaken. Signal fires are agreed upon. You're tasked with carrying the agreement to the coastal watchposts. You ride again, back through villages you've seen before, now with new eyes. At one, they've posted lookouts with horns. Another has reinforced its gates with cartwheels and fishing nets. You see children practicing spear throws with sticks. A girl hits a chicken coop. The chickens are not impressed. A fringe tidbit. One village built a wooden scarecrow dressed in Viking armor and called it Jarl Peckbane. It's meant to scare off raiders, but mostly just confuses birds. The signs of cooperation are small, but they're there. A pot of stew shared between former enemies. A wall built by Saxon hands and Norse tools. A barn painted with both runes and crosses, just in case one deity misses the other's signal. By the time you reach the coast, your socks are wet again, and your horse smells like despair. But the watchtower is manned and ready. A scout recognizes your brooch and lets you through without question. You deliver the message. They nod. Then they offer you ale, dried meat, and a place by the fire. You sit there that night, looking out at the sea. The waves roll in, dark and endless, whispering old songs. Somewhere out there, more ships may be coming, or maybe not. Either way, the land is watching now, listening, preparing. And you once a raider. Now, a rider-air part of that strange new rhythm. The coastal wind slaps your cheeks like an over-enthusiastic ant and tangles your hair with the kind of salt that sticks for days. You shift uncomfortably in the saddle, the wet wool of your cloak refusing to dry, and your cheese wheel now doubling as a questionable pillow. From the lookout tower, the sea is vast and smug, like it knows it's been the entry point for every bit of chaos your island has endured for centuries. It just sits there, humming its endless, sloshing tune, waiting for the next carved prow to pierce the horizon. The men in the tower are new recruits. You can tell by the way they hold their spear sight. Uncertain, like they're afraid it might stab back. One of them has carved runes into his shield and checks them like a good luck charm. Another's still learning which end of the horn to blow. You make a mental note not to stand too close when things get noisy. Still, they're trying. That counts for something. The older guard shows you the system. They've started smoke signals in the day, fire beacons at night, passed from tower to tower like a game of flaming telephone. It's rudimentary. But in this land of patchwork allegiances and muddy roads, it's a lifeline, mainstream historical fact. This form of visual communication signal fires and beacons was used throughout Anglo-Saxon England and into the Viking period, especially as the need for rapid coordination became critical, though not formalized like later medieval watch networks. These early systems helped villages respond faster to raids or military threats. You're tasked with testing the system. At sundown, you light the tower's beacon 3 bursts. Pause. One long flame. The pattern for raiders spotted. Northbound. You squint across the coastline. Half an hour later, a tower on the next ridge replies. One more to the south lights up not long after. The code works. You grin despite yourself. Of course, it's not perfect. A goat walks through one fire and nearly ruins the signal. Somewhere, a tower mistakenly sends wedding party incoming instead. But hey, progress is rarely graceful. You spend the night in the tower, lying on a rickety cot that creaks like it's auditioning for a ghost story. The ocean groans outside. You hear gulls scream like drunk banshés. The wind sighs through the gaps in the wood. It's not exactly peaceful, but it's honest. By morning, it's time to move inland again. There's a council forming deeper in the Danelaw jarls and things, trying to figure out what to do with this new pattern of invasion and resistance. You're to be the messenger. Again, you really need to start charging for mileage. The road inland is quiet, muddy, and lined with hedges that scratch at you like judgmental grandmothers. You pass a monastery burnt out years ago, but now rebuilt. A monk waves as you pass. He's painting biblical scenes with unsettlingly Viking features. Jesus has a helmet. The angels have axes. You wave back. Midday. You pass a convoy traders from the coast. Guarded by local militia. They ask for news. You share what you know. In return, they give you a slice of dried apple and a story about a woman who once fended off a Viking with a pitchfork and a pickled herring. Fringe tidbit: pickled fish was sometimes thrown at intruders both to disgust and distract. It worked better than you'd think. You reach the council site late in the day. It's less grand than you imagined, just a wide field with a ring of tents and a lot of tired people trying to act like they're in charge. You're shown to a fire pit where a woman named Estrid offers you mead and a seat on a log that sinks slightly when you sit. The meeting starts with posturing, accusations, finger-pointing, reminders of old betrayals. One Jarl demands more warriors from his Saxon neighbors. A Saxon Thane insists he can't even get his own men to show up unless there's bread involved. You wonder if these people have ever shared a meal together, let alone a battlefield. Then someone mentions your reports. You shift uncomfortably. All eyes turn. You clear your throat, pull your cloak tighter, and explain what you've seen. The village is preparing. The fire signals. The new raiders testing the coast. You keep your voice steady. Your words plain. No grandstanding. Just truth. Historians still argue whether these informal assemblies had any real power, or if they simply provided a space for leaders to yell and drink. But something about this meeting feels necessary, like a hinge moment. You're not sure what door it might open, but you know you're standing right next to it. By nightfall, a plan begins to emerge. Coordinated patrols, rotating scouts, a shared supply depot near a central village. It's a fragile agreement, tied together by obligation and weak ale. But it's more than nothing. You lie down near the fire that night, wrapped in a cloak that smells faintly of horse and onions. Stars wheel overhead like lazy guards. A bard plays a tune on a bone flute. Someone snores like a dying cow. You smile. This is what progress sounds like. In the morning, they give you a new message to carry confirmation of the alliance. Sent to the western border settlements. You don't even flinch anymore. You just mount up, adjust your socks, and ride. The land rolls under you, patchy with frost and late wildflowers. The trees whisper like they've seen it all before, and maybe they have. But this time, the people aren't alone. They're lighting fires, sending scouts, telling stories, building something new. And you're the thread stitching it all together, one muddy hoofprint at a time. Your horse's hooves thud softly against a mossy trail that used to be a Roman road, now more suggestion than surface. You ride west, where the trees huddle closer and the fog likes to sit low, like it's listening in. You've long since stopped expecting dry weather, and your socks blessed but doomed have surrendered to damp inevitability. The message tucked inside your cloak is rolled tight, sealed with a dab of wax, and smells faintly like smoked fish. You're not sure if that's the parchment or just everything in Britain. The western border villages are a different breed. Less talk, more eyes. The people here look at you like they're measuring your worth in sheep and firewood. When you dismount at the first hall, the reeve doesn't speak. He just gestures toward a bench and ladles you something hot. You eat it without asking what it is. It's warm. That's enough. You hand over the council's agreement proof of joint patrols, food sharing, signal fires. The reeve squints at it, then nods once, the way a stone might nod if it were tired. You spend the night in a goat shed because the hall is full. But the goats are polite, and one of them keeps your feet warm. Mainstream historical fact. As Viking incursions moved westward, the response from local Saxon and Welsh communities shifted from isolated resistance to inter-village coordination. These alliances were informal but practical shared lookouts, food storage, Even joint militia patrols, despite language barriers and decades of distrust. You ride on the next morning, under a gray sky, through hills that seem to breathe mist. Birds follow you, sometimes curious or confused. It's hard to say. You talk to them anyway. There's no one else around to judge. Midday. You find a ruined hamlet burnt out. Abandoned. Overgrown. A sad little ghost of a place. You dismount and explore. There's still soot on the walls. A child's doll in the mud. Bones of animals left behind. Someone carved runes on a charred post names. Maybe. Or curses. You stand still for a moment. Hat off. Wind tugging at your cloak. No jokes here. Just memory. But nearby, in a dip between two hills, there's new life. A camp of survivors, 3 families, rebuilding with scrap wood and stubborn hope. They greet you like a ghost made flesh. Unsure if you're real, you offer the message. It's not meant for them, but they take it anyway. Proof that someone still knows they're out here, that they matter. You help them for a day, mend a fence, patch a roof, teach a boy how to hold a spear without poking himself in the eye. They offer you stew that tastes like boiled optimism, and you eat every drop. Fringe tidbit. One of the women swears the ghost of her husband keeps misplacing her tools just to annoy her. You believe her. The ladle did vanish twice. Historians still argue whether these pop-up communities formed from scattered survivors played any major role in defense efforts. But you've seen their eyes, their hands, their will to keep planting seeds in burned soil. That's worth something. When you leave, they give you a charm string of beads and feathers meant to ward off bad luck. It rattles as you ride. Like bones, laughing gently. You hang it from your saddle and smile. The road bends south again, tracing the edge of the Danelaw. You pass a stone marker half swallowed by ivy, carved with both Christian crosses and Norse serpents. A visual shrug of coexistence. You reach a village called Thornmere by nightfall. It has a wall made entirely of woven branches, reinforced with fishnets and old doors. You love it instantly. The people here are skittish but curious. You're offered a place in the long hall, which smells like apples and wet wool. Over dinner, more stew. Always stew you. Tell stories of other villages. Not just the warnings, but the rebuilding, the laughter. The scarecrow warrior named Peckbane. People need more than fear. They need connection. You notice a boy scribbling with charcoal on the floor, drawing little figures in cloaks. Towers with flames. Boats with curly prows. You compliment his work. He beams. Says he wants to be a messenger someday. You give him your old satchel strap. He wears it like a badge. Later that night, a man tells you of dreams, visions of a white-hooded raven flying inland, circling the hills, watching. He doesn't sound afraid, just curious. You nod like that means something. Maybe it does. You leave Thornmere with a full belly, 2 more messages to deliver, and the quiet sense that something is shifting, not in the wind or the armies, but in the people. They're talking more, listening, lighting fires not just for safety, but for signal for belonging. You ride past a field of sheep who stare like philosophers, and through a grove where the trees lean together like conspirators. The land is old. It remembers invasions, but it also remembers resistance. You stop at a stream to rest. The water is cold, clear, and filled with fish that probably think you're a weird tree. You eat some dried fruit, wash your face, and stare up at the sky. The clouds shift slowly, like they're thinking things over. You feel that too. The western border is stirring, not with rage or panic but with quiet intention. Spears being sharpened, halls being repaired, songs being sung around fires that used to burn in fear, but now burn to remember. And you're still riding, still listening, still connecting one heartbeat to another across a land, trying to find its rhythm again. The road veers north again, through wet meadows, where the fog clings to your boots like needy laundry. You ride slowly now. Not out of fatigue though, yes. Your legs do feel like lukewarm porridge, but because something about the air feels different. Not tense. Exactly. More like watchful. The kind of stillness that makes birds hush, and even the wind pretend it's not eavesdropping. You pass a standing stone so covered in moss, it looks like nature tried to sweep it under a leafy rug. An owl blinks at you from a hollow. You blink back. No one breaks eye contact. You win. The message you carry is the most recent from the consular request for provisions, reinforcements, and a final muster point. You're to deliver it to the Highland watchposts, those scattered settlements along the misty ridges where people raise sheep, send warnings, and generally mind their own business unless absolutely necessary. And right now, it's absolutely necessary. The trail curves upward through pine and thorn. You hear axes in the distance, someone felling timber, a sign of preparation. Or just firewood. Hard to say. At a ridge, you meet a lone scout named Githa. She has a hawk on her arm and a glare sharp enough to skin a fish at 20 paces. She doesn't talk much, but she leads you to the next outpost, a ring fort made of dirt, logs, and sheer stubbornness. The people there at 12 in total watch you, like you might explode into raiders. You don't. They relax. Slightly. Inside their hall, which doubles as sleeping quarters, kitchen, and occasionally stable. You hand over the scroll. The reeve reads slowly, lips moving, then nods. About time, he says, and nothing else. But in the corner, a woman begins sewing a banner-white cloth, red threads forming a twisted serpent, an emblem for a local band. They're ready. Mainstream historical fact. In frontier regions, small fortified homesteads and ring forts acted as early warning systems during the Viking Age. While not officially organized, these communities often took initiative in regional defense, maintaining watch rotations and informal alliances with neighboring hillsfolk. You stay the night. They feed you smoked root vegetables and a thin broth that somehow tastes better than most feasts. The secret might be hunger, or the spoon, which is suspiciously polished. Either way, you thank them. At dawn, Githa offers to escort you farther along the ridge. Safer in pairs? She mutters, which, coming from her, is a warm embrace. The trail is narrow, hugging a cliffside that drops into fog. The hawk flies ahead, circling. Below, you spot a group of strangers. Not locals. Not scouts. Raiders? Maybe? They don't see you. Yet. You double back with Githa. inform the ring fort. They send up a black smoke signal danger in the valley. Within minutes, another tower responds. A third lights up on a distant crag. A ripple of awareness across the hills. The system works. You continue east, cutting through valleys where herders live in turf huts, and the sheep look like angry clouds. One man greets you with a walking stick taller than you are, and stories about a Viking who once lost a duel to a goose. Fringe tidbit. Some Norse raiders did keep geese as both food and alarm systems. No one expects a feathered guardian with attitude. By nightfall, you reach a deeper forest. The trees here are dense, their branches locked like old secrets. You hear drums. Not war drums, festive ones. Curious, you follow the sound and stumble into a gathering. A seasonal feast. Perhaps Samhain or something similar. People dancing in furs. Masks shaped like wolves and deer. You're offered a drink that tastes like fermented bravery. You accept. They invite you to speak. You tell them of the fires on the ridges, the meetings between former enemies, the new raids. Hush falls. Then the oldest woman hair like frost, eyes like dusk says, "So we dream again of resistance." You nod. She nods. Everyone nods. It's a very agreeable moment. Historians still argue whether these ritual feasts had military significance or were purely spiritual. But some believe they were vital for reinforcing local unity, reminding scattered clans that they belong to something larger than fear. You leave the forest with a carved Tokena wooden disc etched with 3 trees. A sign. They tell you that you carry the blessing of the wild hill folk, or maybe just a fancy coaster. Either way, it's going on your belt. You ride to the last ridge post, where a stone tower overlooks the valley that leads to the central muster site. It's manned by only 2 people. Both siblings. Both half asleep when you arrive. You share what you know. They agree to light the signal if needed. You rest that night by a fire they build from peat and pine needles. It smells like spicy earth. You look out across the valley. Somewhere down there, warriors are gathering. Farmers are sharpening sickles. Elders are rereading omens in goat entrails and finding slightly more hopeful patterns. You feel the weight of it, the messages, the signals, the slow weaving of scattered stories into something bigger. Not a perfect army, but maybe a shared breath, a rhythm, a pulse. You adjust your saddle, check your tokens, tighten your cloak. In the morning, you ride to the valley. The muster is near. The story is shifting. And you're still part of the stitch. You descend the ridge, with the mist trailing you like an uncertain ghost. Each hoofbeat softened by moss, and the occasional startled squirrel. Below, the valley yawns, wide, a cradle of farmland and scattered homes, stitched together by hedgerows. Low stone walls. And hope. You follow a well-worn track to the center, where the temporary muster ground rises like a pop-up kingdom of tents, carts, cooking fires, and a few too many confused chickens. At first glance, it looks more like a disorganized country fair than a regional defense force. There's a blacksmith setting up shop under an awning made of what looks suspiciously like an old cloak. Someone is attempting to teach spear drills using a broom. A child rides a pig as if it's a noble steed. You smile. It's chaos, but it's unified chaos. And that matters. You report to a man who's clearly trying to appear more official than he feels. He wears a dented helmet, 2 belts, and a scowl that probably worked better before he lost half his eyebrows to a campfire accident. You hand him the sealed scroll. He squints at the seal, then at you, then sighs. The long sigh of a man who knows more responsibility is on the way. He sends you to the organizing tent, where a council of sorts has been trying to sort sleeping arrangements and food supplies, with all the grace of a herd of wet cats. The good news? Most of the groups have arrived. The bad news? Half of them don't like the other half. One Jarl from the Danelaw refuses to pitch his tent anywhere near the men from Mercia. Someone else is offended that their ale was judged thin. Truly, the politics of mud are endless. Mainstream historical fact. While the concept of a national army didn't exist in the 9th century British Isles, emergency musters like these were historically documented, especially in response to Viking threats. Local lords, thegns, and freemen were often required by custom, and occasionally royal decree, to contribute troops or supplies in times of invasion. You're assigned to help coordinate communication between factions, a glorified errand runner with more mud on your boots than authority in your voice. Still, you do what you can. You broker a truce over breakfast between a Saxon warband and a Norse settler militia, after someone realizes they both hate boiled oats equally. Nothing builds unity like mutual culinary suffering. As the day progresses, the camp begins to take shape. Tents sorted by region. Messengers on rotation. Fires spaced far enough apart to avoid accidental roastings. Someone starts a running tally of who's tripped over the same route. Spoiler, you're currently tied for first. Fringe tidbit? One man wears a necklace of miniature shields, each carved from wood and painted with family crests. He claims it keeps him brave. Another swears his courage comes from sleeping under a bear pelt. He forgets to mention it still has the bear in it. At sunset, a makeshift feast is held. Nothing fancy barley stew, hard bread, and weak ale, but there's music from a bone flute and a one-string lyre. A bard sings of ancient heroes, though he keeps forgetting their names and replacing them with nearby listeners. By the end of the song, you've apparently slain 4 dragons and married a sheep. You take a modest bow. That night, you sleep beside a small fire with other messengers. One snores like an apologetic boulder. Another tells stories of her time on the southern coast, where she once saw a Viking ship carved entirely with sea serpents. She claims it hissed when it moved. Historians still argue whether such ships were real or exaggerated by storytellers. But accounts of elaborate carvings and living figureheads abound in both Norse and Saxon records. In the morning, a scout arrives breathless and covered in dew. A raiding party has been spotted near the river to the east small, but fast. No one panics. Instead, plans fall into motion like dominoes tipped with practiced fingers. Riders are sent. Watchtowers alerted. A few veterans begin checking the edges of shields and counting arrows. You're sent to relay orders to the eastern flank, another half-day ride. As you mount up, someone hands you a bundle of dried meat and a charm in the shape of a crow. For luck? They say. You tuck it into your belt. You gallop across fields that seem to pulse beneath you, through gates left open for speed, past peasants who pause in their plowing just long enough to give a nod or a silent cheer. The land is not conquered, but neither is it defenseless anymore. At the eastern camp, you find a grim but prepared, bunchelled by a woman who introduces herself simply as Brynhild. She has an axe, 3 scars, and the calm of someone who's seen worse and lived. You deliver the orders. She listens, nods, then tells her people to be ready by dusk. No shouting, no dramatics, just preparation. You rest briefly under an ash tree, eating meat that tastes mostly like smoke and vaguely like regret. A boy nearby carves runes into a stick, whispering as he works. "For the gods," he says. "And for Mum." You nod solemnly. Sometimes those are the same thing. Before you leave, Brynhild presses a coin into your handforeign. Old, worn smooth. "It's not for trade," she says. "It's to remember we're all part of something bigger than ourselves." You pocket it without asking what that something is. You ride back as the stars peek through the twilight. The path lit by campfires and torchlight. The air alive with tension but not fear. Anticipation. Maybe. Readiness. You pass a line of men practicing with spears in near silence. Even the children are quieter now. Watching. Listening. As you reach the central camp, someone strikes a drum. Once. Then twice. The signal. Final positions by dawn. You lie down beside the same fire as last night. The crow charm resting beside your head. The sounds of sharpening steel. Quiet prayers. And distant owls cradle you to sleep. Tomorrow is another stitch in the fabric. But tonight, you've helped weave something real. Dawn peeks through the clouds like a sleepy eye. Pale and watery, and slightly offended at being up so early. You sit up slowly, bones cracking like old floorboards, and breathe in the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and nerves. Around you, the muster ground is already alive men, strapping on armor. Women tightening braids and belts. Fire tenders handing out what they claim is breakfast, but tastes more like sadness wrapped in barley. Still, you eat it. You'll need the energy. Today is not a battle day. Not yet. But it feels like one. A day of decision. Of testing. Of lines drawn not just in dirt but in will. You check your saddlebag. Make sure the latest message's new orders. Strategic placements. Contingency maps, sketched in souterre, dry, and legible. Then you mount up and ride out along the perimeter. Part of a rotating chain of messengers, now linking every edge of the temporary alliance. Your first stop is the Western Hill Line, where scouts report increased movement figures in the trees. Shapes along riverbanks. No confirmed raids yet. Just pressure. But that's enough to tense shoulders and shorten tempers. The leader there is a wiry man named Senrik, who wears more knives than strictly necessary. He nods as you report. Eyes narrowed. Jaw twitching. "They're testing us," he says. And not like it's a theory more, like it's the weather. You pass on his warning as you loop back east, where Brynhild's camp has tripled its watch rotations and quietly reinforced the palisades with logs sharp enough to give the forest splinters. Mainstream historical fact. Many such pre-battle preparations in the Viking Age included watchfires, war horns, and the reinforcement of simple earth and wood defenses. Temporary wooden palisades and spiked ditches, while crude, were remarkably effective at slowing enemy cavalry or foot soldiers unfamiliar with the terrain. Brynhild sees you coming and raises one hand in silent greeting. She doesn't speak, but her gaze says it all. Not yet. But soon. You nod. Pass on. The latest update. And ride south, this time. As you approach the river bend, a column of armed men arrives from a distant village late. Muddy, but proud. They bring carts of smoked fish, spare cloaks, and, oddly, a goat named Elfrida that no one dares question. You help settle them in, sort their tents, and pass along their offer of support. One of the younger boys hands you a pine cone dipped in wax. For your fire later, he says, as if that's the most natural gift in the world. Fringe tidbit? Some warriors carried small, fire-starting charms resin-coated wood, pinacones, or even dried moss, wrapped in leather too, ensure warmth, or signal readiness. Less glamorous than swords, but arguably more useful when you've got cold socks. As midday rolls in with a reluctant sunbeam or two, a horn sounds in the far northeast. You freeze, then wheel your horse and gallop toward it. It's not a battle caveat but a signal. Movement spotted. You reach the northern rise, where scouts peer through crude wooden frames strung with gut cord, mirrors of the gods. One calls them. You squint and see what they mean on the horizon. A shimmer of sails. Not a fleet, but a scouting force. Low, fast vessels. Maybe a dozen. You carry the news back to camp. The mood changes, but not in panic. Everyone has been waiting for this. Now the abstract becomes real. You ride harder now, connecting flanks, relaying positions, watching the loose cluster of warriors shift into an organized defense. Spears are distributed, fires lit, signal flags prepared. Historians still argue whether such early warning systems were widespread or just regional luck, but there's growing evidence of coordinated signal networks. Using horns, smoke, and elevated lookouts to communicate across long distances without written language. At dusk, you stand at the center of it all. The camp quiets, save for the sound of whetstones, crackling fires, and the wind threading its way through lines of tents like a nervous scout. Someone hands you a bowl of broth, richer than usual. A quiet thank you for your work. You sit by a fire and drink it slowly, watching shadows lengthen. Beside you, a warrior recounts an omen dreams of ravens circling a bloody moon. Another says she saw a fox walking backward at dawn. Whether signs or just strange mornings, everyone clings to meaning tonight. A bard softly sings near a hearth, the melody barely louder than breath. It's an old lullaby, the kind meant to keep children calm during storms. You hum along without realizing. Then the council gathers, not in a tent, but around a fire under the stars. You stand near the back, still holding your pine cone. The war leaders speak and turn short. Practical, clear. The plan is simple. If attacked at dawn, hold formation and channel them between two hills, where archers and pitfalls will do the rest. If the Vikings try to burn the camp, fallback signals are ready. If they don't come, then wait. No oaths of glory. No shouting. Just quiet readiness. Someone asks what happens if they're outnumbered. The fire crackles. Someone else replies. Then we teach them what it means to fight people who've lost too much already. Oh. There's a murmur of agreement. Then, slowly, the group disperses. You find a soft patch of earth beside your horse and lie back. Stars spread across the sky like scattered grain. Careless and beautiful. The charm from Brynhild dangles on your belt. Catching moonlight. The pine cone sits beside your bedroll. Absurd and perfect. You close your eyes. Around you, an army sleeps. Not born of conquest or command but of resilience. Of farmers who learned to hold a blade. Of children who carved runes in sticks. Of villages that stitched each other back together one muddy bootstep at a time. And you? You're still the stitch between them. The quiet voice moving from fire to fire. Whispering readiness. Carrying story. Reminding people they're not alone. You drift to sleep with that warmth tucked beneath your ribs like a second heartbeat. Tomorrow may bring battle. But tonight brings belonging. You wake to stillness so deep it feels carved from stone. No horns. No footsteps. Just mist. And the slow creak of canvas shifting in the breeze. Your eyes open to a sky, the color of boiled linen. Pale and watchful. Around you, the camp stirs quietly. Carefully. This is the kind of morning where no one speaks above a whisper. Not out of fear, but reverence. The calm before something. Everyone feels it. You stand. Brush pine needles from your cloak. And stretch out the stiffness in your legs. Your horse snorts. Sensing the shift too. She's restless. Tail flicking. Nostrils flaring toward the horizon. You give her a gentle pat and mutter something reassuring half to her. Half to yourself. At the command fire, the war leaders sip broth from wooden bowls and speak in low tones. You approach. Offer a nod. And they motion for you to join. The scouts report that the ships spotted yesterday have vanished, but so have the watchfires from 2 nearby hill posts. The wind carries no smoke. No bird song. Either. That's when they agree. It's not if. It's when. Mainstream historical fact. Viking raiders often employed deceptive landings, sending small advance ships to scout or draw attention while larger forces landed elsewhere. Surprise was their alley swiftness. Their weapon. Coastal regions in Britain lived with the constant tension of no sign, not meaning no danger. You're sent again. This time southward, toward a settlement where the marshland breaks into a cluster of farmsteads, a vulnerable spot. The people there have seen too many winters and too few soldiers. You arrive by mid-morning to find them already packing bundling linens. Tools. Children into carts. The reeve greets you with a tired smile. We've seen this dance before, she says, as if bracing for a waltz with ghosts. You share the orders. Relocate to the interior grove, where a second perimeter waits with food and shelter. They move quickly, efficiently. You help lift sacks, calm animals, carry an old man who won't let go of his rain barrel. Good wood, he mutters. Better than most people I know. Then a cry from the eastern field. You sprint to the edge and see them dark shapes moving through the reeds. Not a horde. just a handful. Testing. Watching. Their shields are round, marked with paint. Their axes gleam even in fog. But they don't charge. They melt back into the grass. Fringe tidbit. Some Viking scouts were known to carry signal bird-strained crows released to scout or confuse sentries. One record even claims a chieftain trained a raven to mimic the whistle of a Saxon horn. Probably exaggerated. Probably, you relay the sighting to the nearest watch point. By now, the muster's edge is shifting coils of people tightening, bracing. Tents are half collapsed, ready to be abandoned. Fires are doused in favor of smoke-free meals. Spears are held tighter. Back at the central post, the drum is struck again. Once, twice, then a third time. Movement on the northern ridge. You ride out without needing to be asked. The soil kicks up in clumps behind your horse, the dew slicing against your face. You reach the rise and join the lookouts. Below, in the valley, the figures gather. Not hundreds, dozens. Perhaps a raiding group too many for a skirmish. Too few for siege. Enough to test resolve. They form a crescent along the water's edge. Shields up. Helms glinting. One figure steps forward, raises a torch, and thrusts it toward the sky before casting it into the river. A message? A dare? Historians still argue whether these symbolic gestures, lighting fires, throwing weapons, shouting oaths, were ritualistic, or just very theatrical warm-ups. Orders are issued fast. You become the line between camps again. Riding east, then west. The signal rhythm building behind your ribs, like a second heartbeat. Along the western slope, Brynhild's group moves into position. She sees you, nods once, and ties her hair with a strip of red cloth. You wonder if it's luck or grief. You deliver your final set of messages before dusk. Then you dismount. Your horse spent, your limbs humming with miles. You hand her reins to a stable boy who looks about 12 and far too excited to be responsible for anything living. Now it's waiting. The sky dims to a smoky lavender. The air smells like iron, damp, wool, and anticipation. You stand near the spear line, next to a farmer holding a pitchfork and a veteran polishing a blade that has seen too many springs. They don't speak. You don't need to. The quiet is full of breath and bravery. A priest walks the line, not preaching, just pressing tokens into palms. You receive a carved fish, symbol of protection, or perhaps dinner. Hard to say. The wind shifts, blowing from the river. A horn sounds not yours. Low, foreign, mournful. You take your place behind the runner's messengers like you, lined up and ready, not to fight, but to carry decisions, changes, pivots. You all wear red sashes now, so archers won't mistake you in the fray. Fray. That's what it will be. Not a war. Not a glorious charge. Just noise and confusion, and the hope that someone remembers where to stand. The stars blink into view. Someone begins to hum again. Maybe the bard. Maybe not. You recognize the tune. The lullaby from 2 nights ago. You hum too. And in that moment, you realize something. You're not afraid. You are exhausted, underfed, probably doomed, and standing in damp boots on the edge of chaos. But you are not afraid. You've carried more than messages. You've carried courage, woven it between watchfires and warnings, between scouts and children, between scarred warriors and twitchy goats. You are a thread in a fraying tapestry, but you're a thread that holds. And you wait now. As dawn prepares to wake again, you're awake before the sky is. The air is sticky with silence, the kind that clings to your skin like fog and expectation. No birds, no breeze, just the shared breath of an army that hasn't slept not really, and is pretending it's ready. You strap on your gear slowly, methodically. Everything has its place now. The red sash, the bone whistle, the pouch of waxed scrolls tucked near your ribs like a second lung. Your feet, remember their weight. Your fingers, their rolls. You drink a little water. Chew some salted root. It's not food so much as defiance. Out past the sentry line, you can see movement in the trees. Not much, but enough. They're testing you? Again. Still. Forever. A horn sounds. Not an alarm. Not yet. A signal north, patrol returning. You run to meet them. Boots slapping wet soil. The edge of your cloak snagging on thorns. The patrol leader is bleeding from the brow, but grinning like he just won a dice game. They're there, he says. But they're waiting. They want us to break. Oh, they'll be disappointed. Orders shift. You carry Themis to west, north to center, repositioning archers, adjusting fallback lines. The camp feels alive now, like a breathing beast curled in the grass. Every movement means something. Every whispered word is a knot in the net. Mainstream historical fact. Defensive formations in early medieval warfare often relied more on discipline and terrain than numbers. Shield walls weren't just about brute strength. They were puzzles, strategies, games of timing and cohesion. A wall that held could break a charge. One that faltered could doom a whole side. The fog begins to lift, and with it, a drum beat. 1, 2, then 3 quick. Sharp. Final. They're coming. At first, it's shadows, then glints, then bodies. Dozens. Maybe 100. Viking raiders charging the hill. Axes raised. Teeth bared. Their war cries slice the morning like rough wind. You've never heard anything louder or lonelier. You don't freeze. You move. Your feet know their task. And you become a streak of color through the chaos running messages. Guiding lines. Redirecting flanks. You pass a fallen runner. Check. He's breathing. Then take his scroll. No time to stop. No time for anything except forward. The first clash happens near the southern slope. Shields slam. Spears jab. Screams bloom like wildflowers in frost. But the wall holds. You send word. Flank support needed. The eastern line responds before you even finish the sentence. Like clockwork. Like poetry. Fringe tidbit, some warriors painted their teeth before battle white. Red. Even Bluto appear more terrifying. It worked. You pass one such fighter now, and nearly trip from the sheer surprise. He winks. You duck past swinging blades, dodge a burning cart, nearly lose your boot in a churned-up puddle of something that used to be porridge. Someone's shouting about goats. Elfrida has apparently gone rogue. You find yourself beside Brynhild again, just long enough to catch her eye. She's been wounded, shoulder torn, but she's still standing, still fighting. She nods once. That's enough. A horn sounds to your left emergency pivot. You bolt uphill, waving flags, shouting hoarsely. The archers shift. Los and Fullies. A wave of raiders scatters. Historians still argue whether these hastily organized militias truly stood their ground against seasoned Viking warbands, or were mostly symbolic resistances. But today? Today proves something. Not all myths are exaggerations. You're breathing smoke now, coughing, tired. But the line hasn't broken. The Vikings regroup. 2. Try the western flank. You're already there, directing defenses. A man hands you a rockyass, a literal rock, and you throw it with all the grace of a fish. It hits someone, probably. The battle pulses, then slows. The enemy starts to retreat, not in terror, but in frustration. Their prize isn't here. Their victory costs too much. You don't cheer. No one does. But the relief is palpable. Like a pressure valve releasing all at once. You sink to your knees. Not from injury. Just exhaustion. Around you, people slump into the grass, panting, staring at the sky. Someone laughs. It's wild and half hysterical. And it spreads. You laugh too. What else can you do? By late afternoon, the field is quiet again. There are wounded to tend, dead to bury, stories to sort. You help where you can, carrying water, kindling fires, finding lost cloaks. A child taps your arm and hands you back your pine cone. You dropped this? She says. You hadn't noticed. But somehow it matters. As night falls, do you sit near a fire with the others? Someone plays the bone flute. Someone else is cooking something that smells suspiciously like turnips, pretending to be stew. You're handed a cup of something warm and mildly suspicious. You drink it anyway. Someone asks, "Do you think they'll come back?" You pose, then say, "Probably, but we'll be ready." And for the first time in days, you believe it. The fire crackles low beside you, casting slow golden shadows that flicker across tired faces. The battle is over for now, and the camp breathes again. Not like before. Not with panic or vigilance, but with something softer, slower. You lie back against a folded cloak, letting the damp of the earth rise gently through the fabric, grounding you with its cool, steady presence. Overhead, the stars blink into place one by one, like tiny oil lamps being lit by some sleepy hand beyond the sky. You trace patterns between them, your eyes barely open, your limbs heavy with the kind of weariness that isn't unpleasant, just complete. Around you, someone hums that old lullaby again. The same tune that wrapped the camp in comfort on the night before the storm. It weaves gently with the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic sigh of the wind. Your breathing slows to match it. You're not carrying messages now. Not watching ridgelines or remembering signal calls. You're just still. The pine cone sits beside you. Smoke, dark, and soot-dusted. But intact. A quiet little talisman of survival. A thread that held, and all around you. Others doze. Some in twos. Others alone. Some with arms wrapped around packs or each other. The battle didn't win peace. But it bought a pause, and, in that pause, a kind of healing begins. You let your eyes fall closed. Your thoughts drifting like leaves on a stream. No more horns. No more plans. Just rest. Let the fire burn low. Let the stars blur. Let the night fold in. You're safe now. Just breathe. Sleep comes easy. And tomorrow can wait. Sweet dreams.